So there are always these kinds of holes to plug in the system. Refugeeism, as I mentioned, refugees are covered separately. So refugee acts are ongoing, right? And were established into some permanency, but as we've seen over the last several years, and even very recently under the Biden administration, there's this kind of back and forth about the cap, how many refugees will be admitted, and that's processed differently from quote unquote regular immigration applications. Although, as I've pointed out, you know, there's not really a regular way, there's just a kind of vision of what the regular way is. Some of you might remember the period of time post 9/11, when there was such a slowdown in processing immigration applications and also applications for citizenship. And that was a kind of, I think, touchstone moment in kind of showing the strain on the immigration system in processing all of these different cases and applications. So it's a very, very complicated system still, and it's certainly not a kind of free entry system. Questions, thoughts? Okay, so going back to this idea, right, that there's always been a wall, right, and a door set into the wall. I want to share with you this really cool timeline that my friend John Cheng, who's a historian, made. And I just emailed him earlier this week, was like, can you please share that really cool image that you showed me at a conference last time I saw you? So here it is, and I'll make it bigger for you. Okay, so this is a huge timeline that he made that shows so many of the immigration acts, the Citizenship and Naturalization Acts and legal cases, and marriage, expatriation and repatriation, and also the acts of marriage where your marriage could change your citizenship. So marriage law intersects with citizenship law very deeply. And of course, immigration always intersects as well with citizenship and naturalization. Not necessarily, right? Some people immigrate and never become citizens, but very often there's this kind of at least possibility of that trajectory. So you notice that this is up to 1965, and I think John just kind of couldn't fit anything more on here. After this, again, we do have other acts that are passed, such as the Refugee Relief Acts, and we can talk about those if we have time. But I thought it would just be fun kind of looking at this. And rather than kind of me just talking at you constantly, I would love everyone who's on to kind of pick something on here that you've never heard of, or maybe something that you have heard of, but just can't really quite remember what it is. So pick something that you haven't heard of and Google it. And let's see what we come up with in the way of the history of restriction, right? This always shifting wall of restriction on immigration. So go ahead and take a second and do that. And then feel free to share that in the chat.
The United States said that they wouldn't impose restrictions on Japanese immigration, but that Japan would like discourage people from going to the United States. And it was never ratified, I believe.
Yes, it literally did just become a kind of gentleman's agreement. So the force behind this, or the impetus behind this, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was this early act, right? It's one of the first things on this timetable in the immigration section. And that restricted labor, specifically laborers from China. So this is what I call the very beginning of the model minority stereotype, because you could come in if you were business class or student or diplomat. But unskilled and skilled labor were very heavily restricted by this act and chiefly excluded. Women were covered separately and folded in later. So Japan did not want something like that directed at them. They did not want that kind of, targeting in an act, but they agreed to do the restriction voluntarily on their end to avoid this kind of targeting in an immigration act. So that is one of the earliest restrictions, and a very key one. And I think has a lot to do also with geopolitical power in terms of Japan even being in a position to make that kind of agreement. Great, so I think we've got a couple different folks looking at the Luce Seller Act. Molly, would you like to share what you found or put in the chat? Or who's the other person who looked up Luce Seller? Eric?
Hey everyone. So it looks like I went to immigrationhistory.org and it seems it says, along with the repeal of Chinese exclusion in 1943, the Luce Seller Act further undermined Asian exclusion and emphasized foreign relations over racial discrimination by extending naturalization rights and immigration quotas to other key U.S. allies in Asia, the Philippines, and India. Mm-hmm. The Philippines gained independence from the United States in 1946, as did India from Great Britain.
Yeah, so this is an act that I think John was kind of wedging it in here because it does ultimately relate to immigration as well. But the Magnuson Act, note that that's during the war, right, when China was an ally of the US, and that allowed Chinese naturalization for the first time. So Luce Seller is after the war, and that is when, again, the geopolitical balance is starting to tilt. There's a heavy emphasis on what's called the recuperation of Japan after World War II in order to shore up democratic government in Asia. And so the Luce Seller Act widens the scope of naturalization of Asians. So if we were in, I don't know, if we were somewhere on the West Coast, we'd probably have folks in the workshop whose families would have been very much affected by these two acts, probably people with grandparents or great-grandparents who naturalized and, had stories of them studying for their citizenship test in 44 or 47 or thereabouts. For those of us who came after 65 or whose families came after 65, we kind of entered into this landscape of naturalization. Now, of course, again, there are institutional barriers and social barriers to accessing naturalization services or filing for citizenship. And obviously for people who enter in an undocumented fashion through some of the many labor flows that still exist from Asia, then that's not a route that's open to them. And that's important to remember as well. I see Kristen has shared about Ozawa v. US. So she writes in the chat, Takao Ozawa was denied citizenship because he wasn't white. Naturalization laws reserve the privilege to free white persons. So you've picked one of my favorites, Kristen. Ozawa and Thind are a pair of contesting cases. Note that they're back-to-back, 22 and 23. And what we have here, I like to think of as a kind of early Pan-Asian American political alliance, because Ozawa petitions on the grounds of a kind of whiteness, essentially, right? Like what both of them are claiming is sort of contesting the category of white and trying, in a sense, to enlarge it. This is long before any kind of equal protection of the laws is well established in case law. And so they're not trying for a kind of equal protection of the laws or equal application of the laws argument. They're literally trying to argue that Asians should qualify under the law. And so what Ozawa says is, well, this is going to be very paraphrased, right? But what Ozawa kind of says is, well, I'm kind of white, right? Like if you look at me, my skin is pale and, so on, these various attributes essentially of whiteness. And the court said, no, I don't think so. Like no scientist would say that people from Japan are white, right? Like we classify white as being Caucasoid, etc. And so then Thind comes along, and Thind was a Sikh American. He was a veteran of the US military. He'd been a student. And so he filed a case that said, well, anthropologically, there are those who would define my ancestry as belonging to the larger Caucasian group. And the court said, nope, that's not what being white is. And it was almost like that famous definition of obscenity, like we know it when we see it, right? And they said there's no way that any popular definition of white would include this person. So you have this kind of amazing pair of cases just boxing Asians out of the possibility of naturalization in very conflicting kind of language. And it's really a remarkable look at the kind of determination not to allow Asian naturalization, because Asians were thought to be inherently different and just not assimilable into the United States. So that's a very, very famous pair of cases. And again, citizenship and naturalization, the ability to access that, to kind of have the full rights and privileges, et cetera, of citizenship, of course, that has an effect on immigration as well, right? In terms of your possibility in this country, you're thinking about how welcome you are in this country. So these two definitely exist always in tandem, even for folks who come and do not intend ever to naturalize. I think we had another, Olivia, I think you've picked a good one down here at the bottom, Kelly V. Owen, one of the early ones. Tell us about Kelly V. Owen.
Yes, I also did a very quick Wikipedia search, so if this is not correct.
I love how everyone's sourcing, by the way. That's very, very academically rigorous of you. So everyone's acknowledging their source.
For Kelly V. Owen, I found that it was a law in 1855 that was based on this couple, Ellen Owen and her husband, who both came from Ireland, but the husband came from Ireland and got naturalized later in life, like when they were older. And then after he died, I guess they were like, oh, well, your wife can now be naturalized as well. So that was interesting.
Yeah. And so that's where, again, marriage law really intersects with citizenship and even with migration law, ultimately. So war brides, as they're called, military brides, that's another really good example of that intersection. In the larger case law around marriage and citizenship, what we ultimately find is that the husband's citizenship is protected while the wife's is not. So a married woman, for example, who married a non-US citizen for some period of time had to forfeit her US citizenship. And that, again, important to the history of Asian Americans because Asian men were ineligible for naturalization. And so this placed a very high bar for Asian white intermarriage of any kind, right? So even in the states where it was allowed, a white woman would have to think about giving up her US citizenship in order to marry an Asian man. So that's where, again, all these different intersections happen. Same thing during the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. There were lots of cases of Japanese American women married to white men or even to non-white men who were not Japanese American. They were allowed to stay out of the camps, and their children were allowed to stay out of the camps. But the reverse logic did not apply, right? And there were such cases. So Japanese American men who were married to non-Japanese wives, that did not get them out of going to the camps. So again, you see this kind of intersection of gender stereotypes and gender roles and legal protections for married couples intersecting with immigration and citizenship. So that wonderful timeline, right? That, again, I hope that just gives you a sense of the complexity of this. And again, the kind of immense restriction that is placed around immigration. But as I also wanted to stress to you at the outset of this, our stories are important too, right? Our experiences are also very important and a part of this history. So there have been all of these efforts now at oral history, what's called microhistory, community history, trying to really bring that back into the consideration of all of these different political histories. So I would love us to just kind of share some of these different personal histories that we have. And I will supply what historical context I can, because some of these, some of our trajectories have been shaped for decades, as you can see, by all of these legal acts. So who wants to tell the first story? We're all post 65, so I feel like I can't even target people by time period.
I have to admit, I had to text my grandma to find the actual year.
I love that.
She texted back and said that it was March 14th, 1968, that my mom was 8 months old, and they had 2 other kids, a 5-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son. And, she was a nurse in the Philippines, and the University of Missouri had a shortage of nurses, and part of a cohort that came over.
Thank you for sharing that. So 1968, so post 65, right? Fitting in that category of healthcare workers who came. And there are so many post 65 stories of people whose families came and, that they ended up going to these places in the Midwest or in the South where maybe they were the only Asian family in the town, right? And that was, kind of part of this Asian healthcare diaspora that starts to spread out at this time. And, we're still seeing waves of that. So the history of care work and medicine also really importantly intersects with this immigration history. And of course, the Philippines has long had this really complicated colonial history, and particularly very complicated history with regard to the US. US has kind of been sniffing around the Philippines for a very long time, right? And so the history of migration from the Philippines is also a really rich and important one. Thanks for sharing that. Other stories?
I'll go. This is about immigration stories, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay.
How did you or your family arrive?
Yeah. So I was adopted in 97 from China. So I think that my situation falls more because of China's one-child policy. And then the US decades before with Korean adoptees opening up the idea through like Hold International that international adoption was becoming mainstream. So that is what I know about my immigration history, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's great. And I just watched the movie Soul Searching on Netflix. I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but it's only from a few years ago, and it's basically a kind of Asian American 80s teen film, I think is the best way to describe it. but one of its main plot threads is about adoption, but kind of in that 80s context, right, where there wasn't a healthy dialogue about this. So thank you for sharing that. You know, the history of adoption and the history of children's immigration and citizenship is a really important and I think understudied one. So refugee relief acts certainly cover some of that, but this is a history that extends back very far. And Olivia kind of noted those Cold War roots of international adoption, where you had very famous cultural figures like Pearl Buck, the author of The Good Earth. She was an early proponent of international adoption from Asia. Oscar Hammerstein of Rogers and Hammerstein was one of her biggest supporters and champions. And you might be familiar with their musical South Pacific, which kind of has a bit of an adoption plot line, adoption via marriage, but nonetheless, it's kind of an encoded adoption plot line. You could even say the same of The King and I, right? That there's this kind of adoption plot line in a sense, this kind of, you know, white parenting ethos in it. And so that's a long history and, you know, very much shaped by geopolitics, as Olivia said, China's one-child policy, the kind of economic condition of the country. Very often what we see is this trend where when countries get richer, right, GDP goes up and they actually close down adoption because it doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right. And so there's this drastic shift. But this kind of crisis that we've seen recently with adoptees who haven't unfortunately had good experience and where there hasn't been oversight, people haven't made sure of their paperwork. And so we've seen a lot of, you know, high profile cases of adoptees whose paperwork was never processed properly, and then they got into legal trouble of some kind or other and got deported. Then it's so incredibly painful, right, to see that happen and kind of see how they've slipped through the cracks of these larger immigration policies. I see we have another story. I also adopted from China in '97 and fell under the Adoption Citizenship Act of 2000 signed by Clinton, right? So that's one of the later acts that were providing for citizenship, although again, we're still seeing so many people slip through the cracks, because just because there's an act doesn't mean that everybody's paperwork magically gets filed, right? Doesn't mean that there's automatically a lawyer out there who's going to help you correctly file your paperwork. So the act makes things possible, but again, who has the access, right? Who has the knowledge and the savvy and a kind of a lack of fear of the system to access these things. And Jesse also shared that American exceptionalism and the stereotypes about Asian women contributed to the success and boom of Chinese adoptions to mostly white American families. Yeah, there's a really interesting body of work about this, about the kind of language of adoption and sponsorship that really sprang up in the Cold War. That was where it really stemmed from. And it was one way that essentially government propaganda drove American sympathy for China as an ally during World War II, sympathy for post-war, post-nuclear Japan. So there were these girls called the Hiroshima Maidens who were sponsored by the US to come to the US for plastic surgery. And they weren't adopted, but it's kind of part of that same language of adoption. So you're exactly right. It very much is about that. And that language was always about women and children, about people who were seen as vulnerable, as non-threatening, as exotic. It very rarely applied to men in the same way. And so that's the kind of language that grew up. And of course, a lot of the adoptees from these countries, not all, right? But a lot of the adoptees from these countries are girls, which has to do a lot with social reasons. And, you know, as Olivia referred to, one child policy. And so there's that kind of very different sort of pathway that that this takes, and that again is not necessarily covered by the larger history of immigration law. So thank you for sharing that. And this is exactly why I wanted your stories to really drive this workshop. So we were, you know, kind of addressing like who we have with us, right? We have a wonderful story here. My mother came over in '97. There's so many in '97. Such a pivotal year, apparently. From India after marriage. She practices internal medicine and struggled to get started in the US because of the language barrier. She still faces a lot of prejudice from patients and coworkers working in the South. Absolutely. This is, again, a very familiar story because, again, the act, the Immigration Act of 1965, it prioritizes healthcare workers, but it sure doesn't guarantee them an inclusive or equitable workplace, right? It did nothing to prepare communities for those people's arrivals. You know, all those things get untold in the political history. And so it's stories like this that kind of tell us the reality of that immigration experience, that you may be able to enter. Fortunately, your mother's able to practice. Some people are never even really able to practice successfully. But that there's this language barrier and that there's this prejudice from patients and coworkers. And that also has to do, of course, with some of the realities of the US medical system. So great stories. I know we're close to 5, and I see a great question in the chat. I'm fascinated by the recent influx of AAPI members into the Triangle in the last 15 years. What spurred that, and will it continue to grow? Yes, it will continue to grow. I'm positive of that. This is a great question, and I think this brings a lot of things together for us. So one thing is just the growth of the Triangle, right? So Triangle's growing. We're not the only immigrant group that's growing, right? The Latinx community has also grown exponentially in the last 15 years. And there's just a really big call for people, right? There are economic opportunities, there are needs for workers at every level, right? And that's the interesting thing, is that we do have this influx of AAPI members into the Triangle, but it's very diverse. We have everything from H-1B workers, so workers on those specialized skills visas who are migrating to the Triangle, specifically to RTP. So we have people in that category. We have people who are coming for and joining our refugee communities. So, for example, in this area and across North Carolina, we have fairly strong representation from Lao, Hmong, Montagnard communities, refugee populations who are being driven by the turbulence in their home countries, their home areas. So we have just an incredible variety, I think, of AAPIs entering. That's the really fascinating part to me. And those are all driven by slightly different forces. So it's not like there's one answer that we can look at there for this growth. It's kind of the convergence of a lot of things. I suppose if you were looking for one easy word, you could say something like globalization, right? But I don't think it's that simple. I think that there are, again, all of these different dynamics that are coming. And let's not forget, within all of that, oh, and thank you, we have another story here, and I was just about to highlight that we also should acknowledge that within all of this explosive growth, we may see it but officially it may not be enumerated, and that's the growth also of undocumented persons. So in our restaurant industries, right, in many, many industries, students even, right, we have dreamers in the Asian American community, that we also have a really diverse set of folks who are migrants, but don't, again, fit that immigrant category, that beautiful vision of the person coming through Ellis Island with the little bundle under their arm. So I think that's a great place to wrap up, right? To really remember that we have so many of these amazing diverse histories within our community, and that we all kind of share this history, this larger history of coming through systems of exclusion and exception and restriction. And I think that is what makes this such a unifying topic. Not always, right? There are definitely still a lot of political differences, but it makes it a kind of unifying concern for our community. And I think that's also why it has become such an important thing for NCAAT to work with the community and really help people who are dealing with their paperwork and dealing with the realities of navigating this very complicated immigration and citizenship system in the US. So thank you all for coming out. Thank you for sharing your stories. Those of you who are able to, and yes, best of luck to those of you who are navigating citizenship and these other issues. I know we're recording, so I'm trying